Catholic churches have been burned in Canada in recent days, allegedly in connection with the discovery of hundreds of corpses in schools that were run by the Catholic Church, the so-called assimilation schools. The assimilation schools, which amounted to 130, were a project of the Canadian government, were started in 1863, and the last one closed in 1998. About 150,000 indigenous children passed through them, and the objective was to take the children out of their communities and introduce them to the dominant European culture that was triumphing in Canada. It was a project of the Canadian government, and the Catholic Church, which managed 70% of these assimilation schools and other religious denominations, collaborated with the government. I repeat, the responsibility, the plan, the idea, the organization, the maintenance, everything belonged to the Canadian government. It is possible that mistakes were made in the management and even crimes, for example, that physical violence was used. We must not forget that until recently it was said that the letter enters with blood. And it is possible that there were cases of sexual abuse. All this is, of course, the responsibility of those who committed them. But it was not the Catholic Church or the other religious denominations that organized the assimilation schools. It was an idea of the government which would have, in the light of the criteria of the time, the best intentions. Just as the religious communities that decided to collaborate with the government in this task also had the best intentions in the light of the time. Now this enormous number of graves have been discovered which have horrified the public opinion not only in Canada but also in the world. We must remember that the schools functioned for more than 100 years, and that in that very long time, for example, the so-called Spanish fever of 1918 took place, which in only 1 year caused the death of 40 million people all over the world, many of them children. In any case, I insist, the responsibility lies with the Canadian government, which was the one that created, conceived, organized, and ultimately managed the assimilation schools. That is why it is very surprising that when these graves have been discovered, the Canadian Prime Minister says that the Catholic Church has to apologize for what happened without knowing if the children buried there came from or died in natural conditions, from hunger, because perhaps the government did not give them enough food, or the resources to avoid the cold, for example, or because of the epidemic. No. The fault lies with the Catholic Church. The Canadian government organized in its time, more than 100 years ago, something that today is considered a cultural genocide. As the report for Truth and Reconciliation says, a cultural genocide in the light of 2015, but not in the light of 1863. In the light of 2015, there was a cultural genocide organized by the Canadian government. And now the representative of that Canadian government, probably from another party, but the representative of that Canadian government asks the Church, demands the Church to ask for forgiveness. And people are scandalized against the Church. I am against burning anything, not only temples, but anything. But it seems to me that the logical thing to do would have been for the protest of that angry, shocked, and horrified crowd to be directed against the Canadian government, which is the one that organized the assimilation schools. It seems to me that it is as if the owner of a bank or the administrators of a bank put some abusive clauses in the mortgages, and the angry and upset people went to burn down the house of the maid who cleans the bank, or perhaps the house of the employee who is working there, or the director of the branch. The church surely did things wrong in the management, surely, and surely it cannot be proved. It will have to be proved. There were cases of sexual abuse or physical abuse, violence against children. That is possible. And if that has happened, we must ask for forgiveness. But the responsibility of the schools of assimilation is not of the church. It is an injustice to blame the church for what is not its responsibility. And it is also an injustice that it is the heirs, the successors of those who organized that, who hold the church responsible for what happened. But this has a great lesson, at least from my point of view. What the church and the other religious confessions did then, in the light and criteria of that time, more than 100 years ago, I think we can call it with a new concept that was not used then, the concept of political correctness. The Canadian government had a plan that was surely seen as a very good, to take the children away from their parents, to take them away from their culture and give them the European culture. I repeat, today this we see as a cultural genocide, but then it was surely seen in a different way. The politically correct thing to do at that time was to take the children of their homes and introduce them in those schools, in those, I don't know whether to call them asylums, orphanages, or simply residences, where they learned the European culture. That was the politically correct thing to do at the time, and the church accepted it, and the other religious denominations accepted it. And what has happened? That the successor of those who were then politically correct reproaches those who were politically correct for having been politically correct. Well, then, that is the lesson, the teaching. Today, also within the church, there are those who ask us to be politically correct and to accept the gender ideology with all its nuisance, abortion, or euthanasia, because that is today the politically correct thing to do. And they say that if the church does not move forward with the world, people will not come to the temples, which is a lie, because those who have adapted still have fewer people in the temples than we do. But they say it even though they know it is a lie. The numbers prove it, but they continue to insist on the lie, aware that it is a lie. We must adapt. This is the phrase. We must adapt. We must evolve. We must modernize. We must be politically correct. But what will happen in a few years? We don't know. It is possible that what today is seen as good, in a few years will be seen as something horrible, as a cultural genocide. It has happened in Canada. It is possible that in a few years abortion will be seen as something horrible, when there are no children, when humanity has long lost the ability to sustain itself because the birth rate is very low. And what will happen if in a few years it is considered that children have to be raised in a family composed of a father and a mother, a man and a woman, biologically speaking? What will happen? Well, people will look at this time and say, time of barbarism, cultural genocide, thousands of children killed with abortion, destructive gender ideology. In 100 years or less, they may think that of us now, just as we now say that what the Canadian government did in 1863 was barbaric. Maybe in a few years they will see it as a barbaric to kill children because there are no children. And then what will they say? What will the politician of the day say 100 years from now? He will not say, my predecessors were guilty with anti-natalist policies. He will not say that because he will be from another party or because he is not interested. He will say the church is guilty because she adapted, because she compromised, because she renounced to her principles to be applauded by the world. And if the salt becomes insipid, it only serves to throw it on the ground and to be stepped on by the people. In Canada, things were done wrong. It is indeed a cultural genocide what happened. But when they did it, they were not aware of that. The Church should have asked herself in the light of the Gospel if collaboration with the government of Canada more than 1 year ago was something they could do. They did not do it. I repeat, apart from the management errors which occurred, and those who committed them are responsible, but the Church, as a whole, submitted meekly to the political correctness of the time, and today they hold her responsible, instead of holding responsible in the first place those who devised the program and the plan of the schools of assimilation. The same thing can happen to us if we today give in to what is politically correct today. We have to be faithful to ourselves and analyze in the light of the gospel and be faithful to that light what the politicians of the day are proposing. Because if we do not do it, we will lose all credibility. And in a few years, when the political correctness is different, they will not hold the politicians of today responsible for what they're doing. They will hold the church responsible, and they will indirectly or directly throw people full of anger against the church, instead of holding the politicians responsible who are the real culprits. Submitting to political correctness is always suicide. When the church has done it, as in the case of Canada, it has always been wrong, and we don't have to make that mistake never again. Until next week, God willing.